This is a Going Back, Remembering UGA interview with Dr. George O. Marshall, conducted by Fran at his home on Riverview Road in Athens, Georgia on October 10th, 2006. Thank you for letting us drop in today, Dr. Marshall. There's always a question about where to start when we're doing these interviews. And I think maybe let's just start at the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit about your early life before you got to Athens and the University of Georgia?
Well, my beginnings started in 1922 in Americus, Georgia, where my father was county agent. I use that information when I try to ingratiate myself to members of our ag faculty. Anyway, he soon went into business for himself, farm machinery, seed, and so forth, and he also farmed. We always lived in town, however, because he had the business in town and he went to the country every day and let somebody else run it and came back. And what he loved to do was farm. I became conscious of the world around me just in time for the Great Economic Depression of 1929. But that didn't bother me one bit because I didn't know we were in a depression. I thought that's just the way the world was. That is the best way to go through a depression and not to know you're in one. I had 4 younger sisters to come along, 5 of us within 10 years. We all went to the public schools in America, of course, and we were fortunate enough to have a junior college, Georgia Southwestern College, junior college at that time in our hometown. Since there were 5 of us, you know we all started there. 3 of us proceeded on to the University of Georgia, and 2 went to my father's alma mater, Wake Forest. Now, they did that because they were tired of being little sister. They wanted to be somewhere that Mary Ann and I had not been before. Anyway, I came up here in the fall of 1941. And my mother used to tell people that I was trying to lead a good life because when I died, I could go to Athens. And that's the way I feel about it. When I arrived here, it was love at first sight for the town and the university. On my part anyway, and I still feel the same way. And if I live with my wife, Charlotte, I certainly have to live here because she wouldn't move. I really love the university. From the very beginning, it was an exciting new environment. Fall of 41, what happened then? Pearl Harbor. Then everything changed. I lived in Clark Howell Hall. All the boys in the dormitories had to move out at the beginning of the spring quarter of 1942 because the Navy pre-flight school came. Clark Howell, of course, has been administrative buildings for a long time now. That's the fate of dormitories, to become offices. Joe Brown, Candler, Old College, all boys dormitories, everybody had to move out. I was fortunate that I had a fraternity house to move into. The Sigma Chi house was the house next to the corner at the corner of Hill and Millage. We had a bus system in town, cost 5 cents to ride the bus. However, I often had to debate between spending a nickel to ride the bus home and spending a nickel to buy a toasted pound cake at Moonwind Drug Company. A TP, as it was called. That's pretty cool, eh? And we had a taxi that just cost 10 cents. Those are the good old days, the day of the 10-cent taxi, though who had the dime? Now, one problem that we didn't have that students have today, and that was parking. Nobody had a car, so that was all right. And when I came up here, the university was a laid-back type of place. Much more so than now. It was a different institution, as a matter of fact. A few pre-med students were very assiduous about studying. The rest of us were standing around the piano singing Glory to Old Georgia. I hate to say that. I majored in journalism because I read the catalog. And according to the catalog, I could take journalism and get a broad liberal arts education and also learn something practical. Well, I have no complaint about that because actually I concentrated on extracurricular activities. But the demand was not there. It was always here for students, but only later did we insist that they get it. It was just offered at first, but now we've insisted that they get it. I remember talking to President Davison about the grade explosion, and everybody was making better grades than they used to. Well, I said there's been a work explosion too. Anyway, when you compare what my students do compared to what I had to do, there's not much comparison. Pearl Harbor, though, was the real difference. The boys had three choices at that point: Army, Navy, and Marines. I'm not saying Air Corps because it was part of the Army at that time, but that simplified things for us. Deant Tate arranged for officers from the 4th Service Command in Atlanta to come over and talk to us about whether we should enlist or not. Now, according to the officer who was a spokesman, he said to us, male students, it is not your duty to enlist. It is your duty to keep in touch with the draft board and go when called. I had a friend in the Army who used to say he volunteered because he didn't give them any trouble when they came to get him. So don't give them any trouble when they come to get you. Well, that was good enough for me, because after Pearl Harbor, I really did wonder, and a lot of males wondered, should I volunteer and go in, and what am I doing in school when the war's going on? And I remind you, in that war, fortunately, everybody was on the same page. There was not a divided sensibility about whether it's justified or go to Canada, anything like that. That didn't come up. The males really wanted to be in the service, and it was sort of hard to stay here when the other great things were going on in the world. And it turned out there was enough war left for most of us, so that we needn't worry about that. The Navy pre-flight boys came and moved us out of the dormitory, and they also built some facilities for the university, which the university profited from. So that was a good experience for everybody, because the boys dropped out. And happily for someone who left in the middle of the quarter, the university would award him credit, academic credit, as though he had been here the whole time. It's one way to avoid writing a term paper, isn't it? And even some got graduation credit when they were close to graduation. Well, that was what the university was doing for the war effort. I made an A in one course because I was going into the service. Believe you me, there was no other reason, I can tell you. The teacher was not going, so he was doing that as his part.
What, did you go in the Army?
I went into the Army, yes. I arranged to be in the enlisted reserve corps because I thought I was protected until I graduated, because I was taking extra courses and went to summer school. So in the end of the summer quarter, just before I left to go home for the 2 or 3 weeks between the term, I got notified that I was 1A. Well, I thought I could be called any time now. I had only 1 quarter left. So I joined the enlisted reserve corps. And that was very fortunate for me, because that guaranteed I could be here 1 more quarter. Colonel Riggs, a professor of military science and tactics that many people will remember, swore me in, but took 2 telephone calls during the swearing in. It was a little more solemn occasion for me than it was him. I kept holding my hand up during the first call, but I put it down the second and started re-swearing. But that allowed me to have my final quarter. And we were very much anti-German and anti-Japanese, of course, but we'd also concentrated on being anti-Gene Talmadge. In fact, we had an organization called the Student Political League. And the Student Political League was a group of college students around the university system who were objecting to the fact that because of Talmadge's interfering with personnel in the university system, we were temporarily, as it turned out, off the accredited list of the Southern Association, and well, we just couldn't have that. So we were against Talmadge. My friend, George Doss, was a leader in the Student Political League. So the day I went in the service, January the 12th, 1942, George met me in Atlanta. This is 1943, sorry. George met me in Atlanta, and we went to the inauguration. and because of his name, we got in so I could shake hands with the new governor. Now, I was going out to Fort McPherson, which I did right away, but the governor and I had something in common. We were both beginning new jobs. When I got out of the Army, he was still governor, by the way, since the 4-year terms. So I was very happy to shake the new governor's hands. I left things in good hands, I thought. But we were very active in all sorts of things, and that was just a new prospect for me because I'd never been involved in anything like that before, all this going on. And of course, it was state news, being anti-Talmadge and so forth, and we helped to get him defeated. And after I got out of the Army, I didn't know what to do. Apparently, I didn't give it any thought when I was in the Army. I did finally take it. I came back here 1 quarter. Then I took a job as news editor of the Madisonian, the weekly newspaper in Madison, Georgia. I was very happy there, but that was not my real calling, and I eventually decided to go to graduate school and teach in college, which my father had always, my entire life, told me I ought to do, but what did he know? I finally proved him right, however. And so I came back here and I got a master's degree, and that was a little different because that was the English department, and I had been in journalism, so I had all different teachers, except for some in history and political science I always minored in those. And then I went to the University of Texas. I have to do that. Got my doctorate and came back here to teach. And when I came back here in 1955, I taught until 1987, 32 years. And I never wanted to be anywhere else.
I tell you, how wonderful to do exactly what you want to do with your life.
That's what I always thought as teacher. Just think they're paying us for indulging our hobbies and talking about what we want to talk about.
Oh. Talk to us a little bit more about understanding that because of the Second World War, life may have been a little different on campus, but give us an idea, first of all, a little bit about what campus looked like physically at the time.
Well, when I came here, of course, it was very small. It was nothing like it is today. And it was about 3,000 students. And the center of the campus, believe it or not, was a bulletin board right at the arch. A person could put something on the bulletin board there and expect everybody but a few ag majors to see it in no time at all. Well, I don't know whether it even still exists now, but that was the campus. And there wasn't much. Of course, there wasn't what we later call the Science Center. That wasn't there at all. And most things happened on what we now call the North Campus, which then was just called the campus. And there's just not much pressure on anybody to do anything. One of the biggest surprises in my life, I think, is the fact that we have an East Campus. All of that complex I could not have imagined. And at first, the university built towards the south, and I used to tell people I think the university is going to wind up in Watkinsville, but then it made a sharp turn towards Augusta. Who would have thought it? But it is a different school. I used to go to Alumni Day and see these old colleges, of which I am now one, come back after 50 years, and they thought they were coming back to the school they graduated from. I knew it was so different, and it's the same way now. I know it is not the school that I attended, and not the one that I taught at is more and more, because I've been retired 19 years now, and what goes on at the university now is, Will Rogers used to say, it's what I read in the newspapers. I don't have the personal experience with it.
You were involved on the debate team, on the Red and Black, Demosthenian, ODK, Blue Key. You did find time to go to school, though, right?
Occasionally, except on Saturday morning. I hate to think how many Saturday classes I didn't attend.
Talk to us a
I
little
was
bit.
not the kind of student that I like when I taught. I used to tell them, I've been there. You ought to do better than you're doing.
What about little commencement and all those things.
The big dances with the big bands, wonderful. I still love the big bands. I've got all those cassettes. Yeah, they're two, little commencement and it was homecoming in the fall, little commencement in the spring, but both weekends of the big bands, and there was people dressed up for them too, and they were just great occasions, and your dates for one of those was very important too.
I understand from the female side that when you went to little commencement, you did have a date, but you sure did not want to dance with that same date all night long.
No, you didn't.
You had to. You were in bad shape if that's what happened.
Oh yeah, everybody was. That just didn't happen usually.
Talk to us a little bit about, in terms of the Second World War. You left in 1943, is that right?
Yeah. I graduated in December. I call myself in the class of 1943 because the alumni office asked us to tell which one we wanted to be with. But I actually got the degree at a ceremony December 19, 1942. We had a formal ceremony here.
My understanding is that it pretty much depleted the male population of the University of Georgia. But
yes,
by the time you left, did you feel like...
There were still quite a few males here when I left, because some people didn't quite get everything in by then, and they were leaving all the next year, however. And then it got to be mainly female, and not much. Most fraternities did not operate during the war. Mine did operate, but barely, and after the war, it became just like every other fraternity, too. We're a casualty of the war.
I think it was Dr. McBee who said that in her school, that when she was in college, that it was during the Second World War, and I think I'm recalling this quote correctly, she said it was a bunch of preachers and 4 Fs.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure she wants that repeated again. Talk to us about some of your favorite professors when you were in undergraduate school.
Well, Tyus Butler's always been a favorite of mine. Now he's a favorite friend, and he was a favorite professor. And in journalism then, there weren't many professors, so if you were a journalism student, you had Tyus. You better like him. You had Tyus Butler, and of course, and you had Dean Drury, too. He's probably the most charismatic teacher I've ever had, because when Dean Drury got those freshmen there and introduction to journalism and telling them about how to do it, you'd think this must be for me because I can defeat the entire world if I'm a journalism major. He was really great at that. And as Gene Patterson pointed out, what Dean Drury did for people was to let them know the sky's the limit. He let them know they can do great things, and he put confidence in them. Tyus was a very friendly type. He was my advisor. He was advisor of every other journalism major, too. How he put up with all of us, I don't know, because we didn't pay much attention to what we were doing, but Tyus did. So when I left here, I started corresponding with him, and we corresponded until he went in the service, and then I lost him. And then happily, though, I've seen him and been with him quite often since I've been back. But I also had, I had Dr. West in a Shakespeare course, but then he left for the Army after 2 weeks, and I had 2 more teachers. That's the way it was. I had a 6-week summer course, a total of 3 teachers. Every 2 weeks, a teacher changed. And Dr. Pound and Dr. Say were always favorites of mine, and I always took political science and history. And in those days, a lot of teachers didn't feel that they had to keep to the lesson. And this was not true in journalism, but it was true in some other disciplines, that they would talk about old times at UGA, university history and folklore of the town and so forth. Very much of what I know about the university law, I learned in a course supposedly devoted to the French Revolution. I won't tell you who taught that. But I don't regret it. Somehow it all came out all right.
So you then went to war and you came back? When did you come back from the Army?
Well, I got out in October of 1945 in the I was in Europe 2 years. and I was in the 3rd Army, General Patton's Army, and I was supply sergeant of a firing battery in anti-aircraft. We shot low-flying aircraft, automatic weapons, 40 millimeter and quadruple mount machine gun. So I was in, and my outfit got to Normandy, and I didn't think we were going to survive Normandy because I looked at the situation map, and we were in a place about as big as a thumbnail, and we had about several yards more to go in the map, and I said to myself, I got here too early. There's just too much going on. And we lost 29 men to death as they're crossing the channel. We hit mines, and after we got there, we felt we were all right because our boys could set up their guns. But anyway, we were over there 2 years, and anti-aircraft really is a very fortunate branch to be in because we get credit for combat, but we aren't in much danger despite what happened crossing the channel. Occasionally people would get on a mine like they do in Iraq today, or they'd get strafed and something like that, but accidents would happen, but it's not like infantry or cavalry, or which turned out here to be tank destroyer and tanks and so forth. You know, our ROTC here had just infantry and cavalry. And of course, we all know what infantry is, and they're very high risk. That's why we lost so many. Now, the boys in cavalry, though, were converted to tanks and tank destroyers and things like that because the U.S. Army did not use horses in Europe. The Germans did. So that when the American planes came over and they saw horses in a convoy, they could just start firing because they knew it wasn't us. They knew it was the Germans.
Had never heard that before.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So you got back in 45.
I got back in 45, and I came to school up here in the winter quarter of 1946. And I didn't know what I was doing here, but my mother suggested that I'd had a dovetailed, shortened experience up here before the war, so maybe I could go back. But so many people asked me what I was doing here, and I couldn't answer it. I just quit. And I went to work on the Madisonian, and after I'd been there 3 months, I discovered I had tuberculosis. And so I was in the hospital then. This is before drugs. I was in the hospital 3 years and 3 months. That's when I decided to teach in college. I got caught up on my reading and actually a little ahead. But the Army took care of me, the Veterans Administration, of course. They took care of me, and they told me that I had it when I got back from Europe, but I hadn't caught it then. And I had no reason to suspect it, so I was just getting more and more tired. And I finally went to the doctor, and he let me know what he was pretty sure I had, and the x-ray confirmed it. So then that's when I got caught up and decided I would teach in college. Then I came here to get a master's degree, and I was well rested by that time.
And then Texas
and
followed.
Then went to Texas, then I came back. So I've had to leave Athens occasionally, but I never wanted to.
And so you joined the faculty at the university here in
1955, and I retired in 1987. And when I came here in 55, we were still basically the same kind of school we'd been before the war, as far as the relationship between teachers and students. But then Sputnik came along in 1957. Sputnik is sort of forgotten today, but it had a tremendous effect on all colleges in the United States. When the Russians put up that little moon, we realized they were ahead of us. That would never do. So we had to get serious about things. And I've talked to the chancellor about this, and he's telling me what all we were doing over here. And I said, you're not giving Sputnik any credit, because that's when we got serious. It's hard to overrate the importance of Sputnik. And since that time, the university has been a different place. And the presidents, though, after that, well, Dr. Idaho was president then. Of course, he went along with it, but everybody had to. I mean, that's just the way it was. And presidents have been very interested in that, in showing that we have a demanding institution. Now, sometimes some evidence comes up to the contrary, but they
Every
oppose to
football
that.
weekend, right?
Yeah.
Certainly, you've touched on something. I think you're certainly right about Sputnik having an influence, and that would have been about 57 or 58. In 1961, there was another major event at the university.
I think that was in January 1960 when we got integrated. Yes, I'd like to mention something about that. I'm glad you asked it, because the American Association of University Professors has not been given the credit that it is due for being instrumental in the faculty activities then. I won't go over everything that happened there, because basically we know that after the Hunt homes were admitted and they had a riot here after a basketball game on Wednesday night, I've always thought it was interesting that they got the game in first. I recall some discussion there. Louis Griffith told me that Dr. Adderhold didn't know whether to cancel the basketball game or not, but he finally decided to have it and try to pretend everything is normal. But the riot was going to happen whether we had the basketball game or not. It would just happen a couple hours sooner. They wouldn't have had to get the game in. But then the faculty had pretty much stayed hands off while the court cases were going on. Of course, we observed the testimony and all of that and read what we could about it, but the faculty took no action. However, when the riot occurred and the students had to be taken out of here and back to Atlanta for their own safety, that made the faculty very disturbed that a riot was running the business of the university. That made us mad, and there was a general faculty unhappiness. Tom Brahena in the math department happened to be president of the local chapter of AAUP, American Association of University Professors. On behalf of the AAUP, Tom called a meeting of all faculty for the next night, Thursday night, in the university chapel. And so the faculty appeared there all with one thing in mind: bring the students back and protect them. 3 or 4 faculty members had prepared resolutions that, without knowing anyone else was, and each one who had a resolution read it. Now, after the first resolution was read, saying bring the students back, several faculty members did leave. It was not quite unanimous. They saw how things were going and they didn't want any part of it. So they walked out, but that was not over 3 or 4, I don't think, and the chapel was full. And then the rest of us heard the other resolutions, and then Tom asked the readers of the resolutions to withdraw to the back of the chapel and change the wording so that we just put them all together, collate them, and then we could agree on that one resolution. There was no question about substance. The substance of all of them was the same. Some expressed more strongly than others. But anyway, the resolution that I understand basically was the one written by Horace Montgomery in the history department. It was read, we agreed by acclamation, we signed it. And to get a high percentage of the faculty to agree on anything is remarkable. You know the definition of a professor. A professor is a person who thinks otherwise. There were very few professors thinking otherwise that night. We were all of one mind. That was the faculty's finest hour. The only time I ever considered leaving the university was when the riot occurred, and I thought, if they are going to let this happen, I can't be a part of that. But then the next night, that settled it. It really was the faculty's finest hour. There was really no occasion for the faculty to do anything before that. It was in the courts. You can't anticipate a riot, can you? Take action against that. Then the faculty responded. And of course, that was a societal problem, the whole question of that, and it just happened that the university was a cockpit where the activity was going on at the time. Society had the problem, society has solved it, I hope, more or less.
Not an event so much, but the Vietnam War. You had been through the Second World War and saw how it affected campus, and then here we were again.
Well, the Vietnam War, of course, it didn't involve many people at all, and there was some objection. Some of the students objected to the fact we were involved in that, and had a demonstration and had an encampment of some kind on a corner of the campus, and the merchants didn't want them down there, and they tried to put pressure on President Chuck Knapp by that time, and some of the faculty members were saying no, they deserve to be there and so forth. So then we had that little conflict there. Some of the faculty wanting one thing and some of the merchants wanting another. So what did President Knapp do? He did a masterful job of this. He appointed the faculty members as a committee as to be liaison with the students. And nothing was ever heard of after that. It didn't get in the paper, nothing happened. He understood faculty. You've got to appoint them to a committee.
Speaking of committees, my understanding, were you chair of the University Council at the time of the Jan Kemp
No,
affair?
I was on the University Council. Well, when the Jan Kemp affair occurred, a lot of faculties did talking, and various faculties of individual schools and colleges passed resolutions and things like that, but the general faculty thought it should do something. Now, I happened to be, at that time, on the executive committee of the University Council. So what we recommended to the council was that there be one representative from each school and college, total of 12 at that time, and they form a committee to see what response the university ought to have to that and what changes we ought to make as a result. We'd got ourselves into some difficulty, and how should we change things? And so the council accepted that, and I was appointed by the executive committee to represent the College of Arts and Sciences. And then I was elected chairman of that committee, and fortunately for me, the other schools and colleges elected members who really had contributions to make. I've been chair of a lot of committees. That was the most independent-minded committee I've ever been on, but they all contributed. And if I wasn't behaving myself according to them, they would let me know about it too. Usually when you're chair of a committee, you can sort of give them the word, but that didn't work with that committee. But I think our report is better as a result. It was sort of a strain getting through it sometimes. But we had an excellent committee, and we did come up with a report, and we presented them to the faculty, and I presented each one. There were about 25 or more individual recommendations, and I presented them to the faculty, and then interim president Henry King Stanford was on the podium there, and if he didn't like our recommendation, he would tell what he didn't like about it, and he and I were old friends from when he was president of the college in America, so we got along fine with that, but sometimes they voted with him and sometimes with me on behalf of the committee. And as I told them, though, that's just the beginning, because in order for a university to operate properly, the faculty always has to be on the job, because administration is always on the job. I can tell you, they don't sleep, and the faculty can't. So as I told them, this is a beginning, but it was a good beginning, I think. And we heard from a lot of people, and did a lot of talking, and finally came up with a report.
I was actually pretty fresh out of graduate, well, actually not fresh out of graduate school. I'd been around a while, and I was working on the staff at the time, and remembering thinking that the morale, just the spirit, was very low at that time. After that, do you feel like that, and certainly I think that the committee report and Dr. Stanford helped raised the morale again, helped everybody feel better about things. Did you?
Oh, well, Dr. Stanford was an ideal person for that because he, like Chuck Knapp, understood faculty and understand how they think, and it's all right to disagree. The faculty, most faculty is apathetic. They just want to have their say, and they want to know it's all right to say something that is not in line with what the administration says, and then they just discuss it out. But President Davison did not like for people to disagree with him, and so that was part of the problem there. He didn't like any kind of disagreement. And when Stanford came along, he showed us it was all right to disagree. And Dr. Knapp did too. I was very favorably impressed with him and his attitude. It's all right to disagree. I met with him just before I had breakfast with him shortly before he became president, because I retired the day he became president. But I found out then it's all right to disagree, because I was telling him what I didn't like about their committee at Tulane, where he had been and what they did and who was on the committee, and it was all right for me to disagree, and that's what faculty wants. Stanford did a beautiful job. That was an honest mirabilis that the year he was here. He couldn't have been a better one, and he paved the way for Knapp. Now, presidents, however, are all creatures of the times in which they live. A president can't be one way when everything else in the world is another way. President Idaho, for instance, is one of the most fortunate presidents we had, because he didn't want to retire, but he had to retire because of his age, just before the student activism of the 60s. Now, what we call the 60s is really the late 60s and early 70s. He had to retire. When President Davison came, the deluge, it occurred, and he had to face all that. I was at a meeting at the University of Chicago in the early 1960s, and one afternoon I went over to the bookstore, and I saw the most awful-looking students there, and I said to myself, I'm glad our students don't look like this. You know what? 5 years later, they look like that. That's why I wondered why we didn't handle some of those things better, because whatever happened here had already happened somewhere else. What did they do?
I was in school then. I would agree with you entirely.
Yeah.
So, entirely.
One of the best students I ever had was the hippiest-looking student you can imagine. And I mean, he was just a tip-top student, but he didn't look like anybody else in the class. This is the very beginning. And he and I had a good relationship, so he was making a funny remark before the exam, and he said, are you going to count off for neatness? And I said, you mean on paper or personally? And the class applauded. They'd wanted me to say something all quarter. I finally did. He got under the desk. You can't tell a student by looking at him, though. You can't do it. You got to see how that person performs.
We've talked about events that affected the life of the university. What personalities do you remember over your years here who affected, from your undergrad days right on, who affected the life of the university?
Well, Deant Tate was always a constant here in the human side of the university. In loco parentis was made for Deant Tate. He wanted to be the father, and he was. If a male student got in jail, called Deant Tate, he'll spring them. So after a while, it wasn't that simple. But he loved the university. I've always appreciated people who love the university, and he had the university's best interest at heart. He told me once about how much he disliked the person who happened to be the father of one of our staff members here. He said, do you know that he told me that Emory boys are better behaved than Georgia boys? I said, no. It's probably so, but he said, he just couldn't stand the thought that anyone would think they're better behaved than Georgia boys. I went over to Atlanta with him once. He invited me and Bourne McCord to go over to hear him talk to the students at one of the Westminster schools, I believe. Anyway, we went over with him, and we didn't know about his driving at that time. But we were driving over to Atlanta, and I thought we were just about late. But we got there just in time for him to walk in the auditorium. But he got to talk about how slow his wife was. And the more he'd talk about that, the slower he'd drive. Finally, he took his foot off the accelerator. We were hardly moving down the highway. Then he got off of that and we went on. He only went fast when we were going through some of these speed trap towns. But we got there, and then we visited a class, and he wanted to show he knew everybody, their family. So Pat Hodgson is the only one I remember in the class goes, and he said, Pat Hodgson. You can imagine how long it took him to conjugate the Hodgsons. But others, oh yes, he knew the father, the uncle, and so forth. Finally, he said some name. The boy told his name, and it was a Slavic name. Deant Tate paused. Boyd and I smiled. We thought he was trapped. Not Deant Tate. He said, what was your mother's maiden name? He knew the mother's father and brothers and so forth. You can't beat him for names. But he was the only one like that overriding the entire campus, so in the whole campus life. And it's very appropriate that the student building is named for Deant Tate because he was a student's friend. He asked me to teach for him once, and he loved to teach. He would substitute for anybody, no matter what the course, at a moment's notice. So he called me and he wanted me to teach the introduction to the Odyssey. He said, I've looked up a schedule and you're not teaching how I'm scheduled. Will you teach the first 2 days of the quarter? And I said, all right. He said, now, I don't want you to talk about the Odyssey, just the introduction. He didn't want me to mess it up, the story. So I said, all right. Now, I just spent 1 day on the Odyssey, introduction, but I thought, well, I can stretch it out to 2. So I did. But then the university announced we're going to have Saturday class. And I knew I couldn't do 3 days. So the 3rd day I discussed problems with translations. And I discussed some problems even the translators don't know about. That's probably the most bored group of students I ever talked to. They didn't know why I was doing that, of course. Well, Deant Tate got back and took over. He's a character.
What about presidents over time? Was Harmon Caldwell president when you?
When I was an undergraduate.
Eventually became the chancellor of the.
Yes,
system.
he became a chancellor, but he was president just the 15 months I was here as an undergraduate, and he was a rather august figure, and we halfway expected him to be talking Latin when he talked, because he used to speak of these classic shades. And I was with some of my fraternity brothers once, and we were meeting President Caldwell, so one of them got us to fall in step, and he said, now when we get to him, I'll start off, and we will say, how do you do, President Caldwell, which we did, and we kept going. We don't know how he went in one way and we went the other. But then Dr. Adderholt was president when I came here to teach. And he became president when in 1950. Yes, I was here. I was getting a master's degree when he became president. Then I went to Texas. He was president for 17 years. And he was very fortunate, as I say, not only in he had to retire when he did, but in that his skills were getting the buildings the way he did, and having Senator Russell in Washington was a good thing, and Adderholt here, and we just built a lot of those research buildings on Research Road over there. It was very important thing that was going on there. And I told somebody the President Idaho presided over an empire on which the concrete never set. We were always building. We're still building now. And it's amazing. But Idaho was the right man for the right time. How he would have handled a student rebellion, I don't know. Dr. Davison did a lot for the university, though. Unfortunately, his leaving after the Jan Kemp episode has sort of made some of those things obscure in people's minds. It's very appropriate that he have a building named for him and the kind of research building it is, because he hasn't gotten the credit that he really deserves. I didn't always agree with him. I was one of his advisors. He didn't want me to be, but I was. And then I've talked about Stanford, and then Dr. Knapp, and Adams, of course, is exactly the kind of president that the Times called for. He's a great fundraiser. He raises the money and he builds a building. He sometimes ruffles people, but all that will shake out one way or another. This River Road thing reminds me of just before I got here, the university decided that would be Fraternity Row on River Road. And the Sigma News actually built there. But then the war came along and there wasn't any building after that, so the Sigma News were marooned out there. And the few boys who did have cars could take their girls out there to park. You didn't have to use much gas just to get to the River Road. A boy called the fraternity house one afternoon and said, "Can some of you come out here? It's raining and my car's stuck." So he had his girl out there on the River Road. And the boy answered the phone and says, "Why did you park when it was raining?" He said, "It wasn't raining when I parked." We had to go out and get him. Now they want this to be Fraternity Row again. They tried that
cyclical
once.
nature of academia, or I'm not sure you can call Fraternity Row academia. So, you want to take a break a minute, Bill, and let? Are you okay?
Take some water, sir.
Will you stop a minute?
I just did a little bit, but
I'm looking back.
Yeah.
You've been, Dr. Marshall. You could do stand up. And that's what you did for 32 years, wasn't it? You did stand up.
That's what they paid me for.
Talk a little bit about how students have changed over the years, and then we'll have Bill, we'll stop just the interview and we'll ask you to read your Deant Tate essay. Would that be all right?
Oh, today? Yeah, sure.
Are you worn out?
Oh, no, I think I can do it fine. When I first started teaching here, I taught freshmen only for about 6 years, and then for many years, the senior professors in English did not teach freshmen. Then the need came along for us to teach freshmen again. So I had one group of freshmen, and some of whom could not do the work. It was not that they wouldn't do it. They couldn't. They shouldn't have been in college. They were ill-advised to be here, and I felt sorry for them, but I knew they couldn't do it. But then when I taught freshmen again, our standards had increased so much that I don't think I taught any students I felt could not do it. I taught some who would not do it, but I don't have to feel sorry for them. They wouldn't do it. But they were all capable of doing the work, so the caliber of students in academic matters has certainly increased a great deal. Now, of course, students have always done foolish things. We did foolish things when we were here, and they're always going to do foolish things. I think that's part of growing up. And I always tried to remind administrators that. Now, they get mad at the Red and Black. Oh, I was a columnist for the Red and Black. All that nonsense I wrote. Well, I'm just a student. And I said, well, they're just a student. Students do this thing. If they're adults, that's something else. But don't worry about it. And of course, we were much more in line with society's norms and in our behavior. We generally were Victorians, and we knew when we were not Victorians. And right now, they don't think students have any concept of that. At least when I was still teaching, I'm sure it must be same way. I used to tell my students that my generation invented innocence, but theirs hadn't done much to perfect it.
That's great. This has been a lot of fun. I don't think I'm supposed to say that on tape, but thank you for sharing your memories with us today.
That's good, right? I wrote my recollections of Deant Tate, not that they are very illustrious, and they're rather mild, actually, compared to a lot of Deant Tate's stories. Mine do have the advantage of being true, however, but since he's been such a great figure around here and was for so long, that I thought everything that people can remember about him should be recorded. So it's in that spirit that I wrote this little essay, which I like to do. Many UGA old-timers have a Deant Tate story. I have several. Few of them are about when I was an undergraduate, because then, I'm proud to report, my contact with the Dean of Men was minimal. Occasionally I would see Deant Tate drive by slowly in his coupe as we were milling around before hanging Jean Talmadge in effigy or otherwise expressing our political opinions. He was just being sure that he knew what was going on. In 1942, I spent the Independence Day holiday weekend as a patient in the university infirmary. I wasn't actually sick. The doctor saw that I was exhausted. I needed rest to continue my hectic schedule of extracurricular activities once classes resumed. It was rather boring because there were few of us there and the other students had scattered. Deant Tate was our only visitor. On Sunday, he brought us the newspapers and stayed to tell a few stories, one of which I remember. He said that in a foreign country, a sign in a shop window saying English spoken usually means exactly what it says. They speak English, but they don't understand it. There was one more tangential contact. An Athenian who had lived his entire life elsewhere was brought back to Athens for burial. There was no family in town, nor could any of them come. The family told the undertaker that nevertheless he would like for somebody to be at the funeral. The undertaker called Deant Tate. Who else? Deant Tate was always the person called because he solved problems. Deant Tate telephoned the Sigma Chi house and offered to excuse 6 of us from class if we would serve as pallbearers. He also said that each of us would receive a modest honorarium. It was an offer we couldn't refuse. At the funeral, we were the biggest hypocrites in the world, trying to look sad while being paid for missing class. Because my contacts with Deant Tate had been so slight, I was surprised when he recognized me when I came back after the war to do graduate work. Here's how that came about. J. Smith, my friend and fraternity brother, began teaching in the history department in 1949 at the same time that I began working on a master's degree in English. Jay suggested that we sit together at football games. I told him that I didn't know how we could do that since my seat was in the student section. No problem, according to Jay. He said that faculty members on his row in the stadium sat anywhere they wished on that row instead of in specific seats, and there was always plenty of room. He said that I could join him there after I'd gotten in the stadium using my student ticket. That's what I did. I had no trouble finding Jay, and just as he said, there was plenty of room on the row. That's the way it started, but the row gradually filled. That was still all right. Everyone was seated comfortably, and nobody asked me what I was doing in the faculty section. Then after the row had filled, one other person arrived heading for our row. You guessed it, Deant Tate. I pretended I didn't know him. After looking around to see where he could sit, he decided he could squeeze in between me and Jay. After wiggling in, he turned to get a good look at me. When he did, he said, "Hello, Marshall." Shortly after I joined the faculty in 1955, Deant Tate invited Bourne McCord and me to accompany him to Westminster Schools in Atlanta, where he was to speak in chapel. That's the only time I rode with Deant Tate. Few people rode with him more than once. He drove much below the speed limit, except when going through small towns which had a reputation as speed traps. Then he speeded up. We arrived just in time to go from parking lot to auditorium. After his speech, he accepted the headmaster's invitation for us to visit some classes. I'm sure that the classes were hand-picked to give a good impression. Nevertheless, we went. Deant Tate asked each student his name. Then he told who he knew related to the student, usually a father or an uncle. Pat Hodgson was the only student I remember. You can imagine how long it took Deant Tate to conjugate the Hodgsons. Deant Tate was clicking them all off until one boy introduced himself by a name that was apparently Slavic. When Deant Tate paused, Boyd and I smiled. We thought that he was stumped. Not Deant Tate. He asked the boy what was his maiden's name. What was his mother's maiden name? He knew the mother's brothers. Once again, as I learned in the stadium, when it came to knowing people, Deant Tate had no peer. Though Deant Tate's main contact with students was a dean of men, he occasionally taught an English class. Once when he was scheduled to teach a sophomore class in world literature, he had to be out of town the first 2 days of class, Thursday and Friday. He telephoned me and said that he had seen the schedule of classes and noticed that I did not have a class during the period when his was scheduled. He asked me if I would teach for him the first 2 days. When I agreed, he said that he was starting with the Odyssey, but he wanted me to confine my remarks to the introduction. He wanted to teach all the narrative. I presumed that he didn't want me to mess the story up even before he got started. I agreed to spend 2 days on the introduction, though when I taught the course, I never spent more than 1. I knew that I would be able to stretch my comments out. Then the university announced that he would also have class on the first Saturday of the quarter. I knew that I couldn't keep going on the introduction for 3 class periods, so on Saturday I discussed problems of translation. I talked about problems that even the translators didn't know about. That may have been the most bored group of students I ever lectured to. Since Deant Tate liked being in the classroom, he was a willing substitute for any teacher who had to miss class. When Marie Dumar was scheduled to spend a week in the hospital, he volunteered to teach her class in advanced grammar. During the time that Marie was gone, he never mentioned grammar in class. Instead, he talked about his favorite subject, the Tates of Pickens County. When Marie returned, he said, "Marie, this isn't very advanced grammar." I thought she would never stop talking about his comment. Deant Tate and I often traveled together to meetings of the Georgia Association of Junior Colleges. He represented the administration, and I represented the lower division, especially English. It was always convenient for us to go in my car. We had some free time one afternoon when the meeting was at Gordon Junior College in Barnesville. Deant Tate asked me if I could take him to Griffin so he could get a shave. Since the weather was still warm, the door to the barber shop was left open. I sat near the door. Deant Tate sat in the first barber chair, draped in the customary white sheet, and soon had his face covered by a wet towel. As the towel was working its magic, a college-age boy who was walking by said to me, "Is that Deant Tate?" He had recognized Deant Tate's stomach. When the towel was removed, the boy conferred with Deant Tate about the prospects of his being readmitted to the university. "There has been only one Deant Tate. We shall not look upon his like again.